Hello everybody, this is the John Crow, and after the game jam I thought I would go through some of the breakdowns of some of the mechanics that I'd come up with for Royal Jamaica Golf. So I plan on doing this over the next couple of days, and I think I was going to start off with the leaderboard, as it was the very first thing I had to develop in order to build the entire framework for my game, and it took a few days to kind of come up with it. I looked at a number of kind of different options. Cyber Dragon had a really interesting incrementor system. The scoreboard, I believe, for the soccer setup that he used. And I was thinking about different ways to do this, and ultimately what I came up with was a system based off of the basic platform. And so what ends up happening on each shot is there's a stroke counter that each club measures. And so if you grab the pickable on that character, there's some logic built into the clubs through the use of some of these switches. And there's an overall score incrementer on them. And so this incrementer for this particular club is targeting, you can see it's targeting the practice hole here. But essentially, if we take a look at the logic on it, it's waiting for a message where the ball gets hit. It broadcasts it as many times as possible, and then it sends out a message that increments the practice score. And all of the messages that hit the actual ball are driven from the hit knob that's on the controller. You can see that the hit knob here is passing off a message that hits the ball, and it broadcasts within a specific range. So if you look at the logic on the hit control, it's just a button that sends out the message for club 8 to hit the ball, and it lasts for 1 second. One thing I did find is that if you just kind of hammer on the control and just spam it, you can throw the leaderboard logic off. My hope was, and I could go back in and fix this and maybe just have a bit more of a delay on the hit itself until it can repeat again to prevent that from happening. But in golf, the idea is that you take one shot and you have to walk up to your ball again. And so I assumed, maybe incorrectly, that that would be enough of a delay to allow the counter to work. So anyways, pressing the interact button here, so you're pressing the E button to hit the ball, it's sending a message down to the score incrementer. It's receiving that message, and then what we are doing is, let me just grab this, there's two of them here, and again you can see some of the order of selection here. It's kind of crazy. There we go. So we increment the score, and this one here is actually that's the ball delay. So basically we're going from the club's hit control all the way down to the score incrementer, and what that's doing in turn is it's sending a message down to a lot of my relays I have down here for my overall hole logic. So the overall scoring system is done as one giant platformer going this way, and so each one of these represents a particular stroke. And to get the timing for this, I've got a platform sitting on this stroke counter here. And you can see I've got the stroke counter set up for an offset of 94 along the x-axis, and the platform speed is really key here. I actually found I had to use a platform speed of about 1.1, otherwise the counter would not perfectly increment one block every single time. And so what ends up happening is that platform gets turned on and turned off at specific times, and those on and off points, the advance message and the stop advance message, those are being driven by some health components that are being killed off when they receive a given message. So when they receive the increment score message, in this case this is for the entire course, it then triggers that message to stop advancing the number, and this one here receives the score message and then advances the number, and it's sending that message off to my slider, which is my element here that's attached to the platform. So you can see over for my practice hole, the logic is over here. I was experimenting a little bit with placing the hole logic, the leaderboard logic closer to the holes It didn't have a huge impact on the time it took to receive and send the messages. So I'm guessing it's just the amount of logic I had in here that would affect that. So you can actually see here, there's my health stop. This one here is my health start. And if you look at the start, there's a health component to reset with no delay. That's really important there. And when it receives the message to increment the score based on a hit from the club, it's advancing the slider and sending the message off to the practice PR slider. Again, you can see the practice slider there. And I think I've actually duplicated my controls. Whenever I hit Control D in here, it makes duplicates of the controls. It's kind of annoying. So I'm definitely not going to save any of this. Just delete that. So that's the first thing that's happening. In order to actually detect the holes, however, I've got a couple things happening there. Let me just move this out of the way. So each one of these blocks is a speaker component, and it's just sitting there listening for a message. It's listening, it's detecting an entity. It's detecting my practice slider, the exclamation mark, and when it sees that object, or the object gets within the vicinity of the speaker component search radius, it's sending a message, practice hole +0, and if you look here, I can go to any one of these, and again, it's just detecting that slider within a 1 unit range, and sending a message +5, +6, +7, etc. Once it sends that message, practice hole stroke 1, it's sending that message up here to a block, and that block here is turning on one of the scorecards. So you can actually see a couple things are happening there. It receives the message, practice stroke +1, it sends the message 1 on, and it sends it off to a couple of tags in the vicinity. And again, my Control-Alt-D isn't working, where it's turning on some logic on my signboards, on the actual scorecards themselves. Did I duplicate that? I'm pretty sure I did. Yes, I did. Just make sure it's not moving. There we go. So that's kind of how the practice round hole logic is set up, and ultimately what that's doing is it's sending messages off to my hole cards, and you can see if I just grab one of these, it's going to be, let me just go into my outliner here, and I'm going to call this, what did I call this one? Numbers PR? Yeah, there we go. So you can see I've got it based in the tens column on the left side here. So if I grab that one, that is my, if you were scoring 20, this one is if you were scoring a 10, and this one is if you were scoring a 0, and I'm just looking over here. So in the tens column, this is a 0, this is a 1, this is a 2. The practice hole, none of the holes go past a score of 9, they cap out at 9, but initially you could go up to 21 per hole. I wanted to have around 21 kind of tie in there. It's a little bit too clever on that because it's just twice as much work times 7 holes plus a practice hole. It just became untenable, so I just capped it at 9 for a total of 63. So ultimately, when you look down at my logic here, where we go, I've got 63 potential strokes that I can count. So that's globally for the whole stroke counter, and you can see that I've got individual holes set up here as well. And if you look at the logic on the scoreboard, let me just pull up one of these here. So I'll go into my ones column. Let's just grab a random one. So this would be for the number 5 being turned on and turned off. You can see that it's got a tag, practice hole in the ones column, that would be a 5. And you can see that it, if you look at the toggle behavior, it's just 5 on, 6 on. So basically anytime the practice hole slider advances, it's turning one off and turning the other on. So it's pretty simple in that way. This logic here, this is actually for the reward system. And so this is, a couple things are happening here. So my practice slider that's advancing, or the overall slider that's advancing, also has a component on it that allows me to do a drop on death. And if we look at the practice slider in here, and here's our advance and stop logic that increments it. And you can see that at the end of every hole, so when you sink the ball into the hole sends off a death message that locks in the practice score, and it actually ends up killing that exclamation mark, which means you can't add or remove to the score for that particular hole. And it then sends the message practice hole finish back to the course itself. And on death, the important thing here is it's dropping this little apple, and the apple has a health component, and it also has a tag called holescore.per. So let's say that we end up with a 3 on a given hole. This would advance 1, 2, 3, and the moment I sink the putt on the hole, it kills this slider. It'll drop a little apple here, which means there's another speaker component sitting right here waiting to listen for that apple. And so for each hole, I then have to detect what the score is. So you can see that if it detects this drop once the marker is killed, it then understands that that's a par for that hole. Or, you know, if you get an ace on a particular hole, that would be this first one here. And then we're setting that, hey, you scored a hole in one. But again, every one of these is just looking to detect that drop based on depth. And this is just parented so that I can slide this whole thing. Is this the one? Hang on a second. That would be the hole in one. So yeah, for this one here, I gotta kind of pull it back, and then okay, it's right there, because this is actually stroke 0. So it sits there. This kind of initializes the scoreboard, so it doesn't count towards your score, but the scoring basically starts from this one forward. And then ultimately, once that drop happens, we're sending off messages to the logic I have built around the hole here, which then helps to determine what kind of reward you're getting on the hole. So this one's listening for the hole in one, the birdie, the par, the bogey, the double, the triple, the quad, the 5 over, and the 6 over, and I'm only really giving rewards for hole in ones and birdies. If you're scoring par, you're not really getting rewarded for that. So you can see here that I've got drops based on spawns. So if I score a birdie, which is what's being triggered, move this out of the way again, which is what would be triggered on this one. So we get the drop, and it understands that you've now scored a birdie, so it sends that out. Oops, let's undo that. And it'll drop the reward. And you can actually see right here, this would represent the birdie. So you can see we just have an asker, scored a birdie. It tells you what you've dropped, or what reward has dropped. And so again, you can see it's requiring that score a birdie, and it ends up sending off a message that moves you on to the next hole, and then that in turn triggers some other logic that gets you moving again. And so that's basically it. And all of this, so the practice hole doesn't actually tie in to the overall score. So if you are looking at the leaderboard, which I have over here, this first hole right here doesn't count towards the total score. So the total score is an aggregate of hole 1, hole 2, hole 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So this one is just practice. And one thing I could not figure out, and I guess I just ran out of time, is at the very end of this hole, there is an asker that asks you if you want to replay the hole or continue into the main course. And once you've completed this hole, it actually unlocks the alpha gate, so you can actually get into the main course. You actually have to play the practice hole in order to access the main course. And the one thing I could not figure out, and I'll probably come back and try this again, is I wanted to be able to reset this slider, but the problem is that once you complete the hole, that slider is killed, and so I couldn't like move it back to the beginning again, and I just didn't have time to figure it out. Oops, I guess I didn't want to delete that. So that's where we are with that iteration. I'm really interested in kind of pushing this a little bit further. The logic worked really well once I figured out that slip factor, and you know, one thing you do realize is that the idea that these sliders, if I grab that slider, let's see if I can grab that right away. The idea that I'm moving 94 units at 1 block per second, it's not exactly right. I kind of had to figure out the exact value for this, and that was just a little trial and error. If I didn't get this number right, the more holes, or sorry, the more shots that I advanced, the more slip would occur, and eventually the numbers wouldn't line up, and it would either like lose a stroke or gain a stroke. So yeah, it took me a lot of thought to get through that and to actually get it working. And as I mentioned, I spent probably the first 4 or 5 days working out that scoring system and the reward system. And actually what I never got into as well is my penalty stroke system. And that penalty stroke system was set up down here, but that had to also be able to insert an extra stroke into the overall scores per hole and into the overall leaderboard tally. And I kind of got it working, and I actually had to have the penalty stroke as kind of an experimental feature on the practice hole, because it wasn't totally working 100%. So I kind of had to abandon it. So if you do play the course, sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. Sometimes you'll drop a ball really nicely, like right in here, you'll get your splash. It does have a little bit of latency, but eventually you'll get the warning and you'll actually get the increment added in here. But sometimes this thing will just keep upgrading. You hit one ball in the water, and the hazard penalty that you incur will add 1, 2, 3, 4, and it sometimes got away from me a little bit. So I'd love to go back and figure out why that was. I was chatting with Cyber Dragon probably about a week ago about this, and he had run a test that had it working correctly. So yeah, and I know there's a solution to it, just time didn't allow for it, and that's what a version 2 is for, right? In any event, I just wanted to do a little bit of behind the scenes as to how I was thinking and what kind of mechanics I had to invent that never existed in the sandbox before. And for this reason, I think the Royal Jamaican Golf is kind of a pushing of the sandbox to new limits, just because it wasn't there before. All the RPG stuff was there, all the abilities to replace avatars with any kind of sporting mechanism are there, but the actual logic behind it wasn't there. And coming up with that is something I'm particularly proud of and thought I would share with you today. In any event, I'm the John Crow. Hope you learned something from this. I know that Game Jam was awesome just in terms of pushing my knowledge of the sandbox way further than I thought I could in 2 weeks. And if I can do it, I know everyone else can as well too. So with that, take care everybody, and I hope to have another one of these videos showing you the breakdown of some of the processes I've come up with for this overall Game Jam. Take care.